Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode number 6 of A Rebel Without Applause, the Bill Calmanson podcast. It's my running commentary on that cockeyed caravan called life where, yes, all things are considered, and hopefully my mantra is accomplishment prevails over celebrity, insight over bombast, and where, most definitely, conventional wisdom is not wisdom. And it's, what's the date? It's August 1st. We're in the dog days of summer, fires blazing across all of our state. I just started on a road trip up Highway 395 up the eastern ridge of the Sierras, and it was frankly like nuclear winter. There was just smoke everywhere. The density of the haze and the breathing was difficult. So there was a plot twist. After spending one night camped out at one of my favorite little hot spring retreats up in the eastern Sierras, I can't name it for fear of ruining it, but it's this beautiful little creek and a canyon next to which gurgling hot, almost nearly boiling water comes popping out of the earth and streams down into these pools that are exactly adjacent to this very cold creek that runs out of the eastern watershed of the High Sierras. So I camped there for a night, did the cure in the geothermal hot tubs right there. It's a completely natural setting, and the little pools are basically built by these just people who show up, and it's these little granite rounded rocks that form these pools, and you hang in there, and the top pool is the hottest, and each little pool, there's 3 or 4 of them, the temperature gets progressively cooler until it returns to the general temperature of the ice cold, freezing Sierra Nevada stream, which flows out of the upper elevation and snow melt. So I was there doing a little fly fishing, but alas, the air quality wasn't really good enough to hang, so I flipped it around and drove 6 hours back, and returning here to my cozy confines underneath the sign, and I'm going to resume episode number 6 of what was formerly entitled Bill K's Cockeyed Caravan, but I think I'm going to switch it to A Rebel Without Applause. Both are movie references. A Rebel Without Applause, famously my ode to Rebel Without a Cause, Nicholas Ray's wonderful story about disenfranchised suburban kids living here in Los Angeles, the movie that helped elevate James Dean into superstar status, but it also starred Natalie Wood and Jim Backus. You might remember him. He was the voice of Mr. Magoo. And the movie, I don't remember the exact year, it was in the 50s, late 50s, and you could feel this baby boom generation, these suburban beneficiaries of all the success that the United States had had in the post-war world. They were living in absolute comfort, yet they were uncomfortable. They were rebellious. They were angry for reasons that weren't exactly obvious, but would come into full flower just a few years later in the 1960s. So A Rebel Without a Cause was the movie, and A Rebel Without Applause is the podcast. From here on out, that will be the title, and my little RSS feed will change, and I'm going to relocate it very soon onto a new server as I'm trying to scratch my way into the higher elevations, up the hierarchy of podcasting. And why do I do this? Well, there's always the simple reason. As a merchant of mirth, as a comedian, I guess the main reason is I'm not getting booked, and I need the microphone. The microphone is my therapy, and I am called to that Torah, and I need to speak, and here I am. And if there's one core truth, and I've said this before, you've heard it, there's one core truth that's occurred to me, is that my need to express far outweighs anybody's desire to hear me. So here I am, speaking, and if you have time to watch back episodes of Gilligan's Island on Hulu, maybe you could find 30 minutes to join me as I explore the nether regions of my brain, and maybe, just maybe, I can shed a little light on yours. Besides, for me, I just feel that the social moment that we're in, this incredibly dire moment in our political history, to be sure, it sort of demands that we speak. If we want to preserve free speech, the best remedy I have is to speak freely. And one caveat to that is, yes, speak freely, and also support your local newspaper. And by that I mean subscribe. For me personally, I want to sustain the Third Estate, and the best way to do that is to support it in the way that it needs it most, and that's financially. So I maintain 2 subscriptions, one to the New York Times and the other to my home newspaper, the LA Times, both of which I receive only digitally. So I'm not being buried in newsprint daily. I don't have newspaper guys dropping that thud of newspapers every morning outside my door, and then I spend the rest of the day trying to figure out how to dispose of this garbage. No, it comes to me digitally, and it's all there, and there's no trees at risk, and our forests hopefully will remain preserved if indeed they don't burn down, because we're not consuming that wood for newsprint. So if you want to support free speech, speak freely, and also get a newspaper subscription. That's my my recommendation, because the social moment demands it. And, well, what is in the social moment? The social second? Well, last night I saw it on the feed today. They had another KKK rally presided over by the PVP, Putin's vice president, down in Tampa, and there was a general near physical assault on the media, CNN in particular, the fake purveyor of fake news. And once again, all I could think of was Germany in like 1933, this just absolute assault on the institutions that we need to keep us free. And that's the free press, which is under assault. And I don't know what to say about that. Other than that, I wanted to recommend a couple movies that I think are important and sometimes overlooked, but classics nonetheless. And the first of them, and this is a movie to rediscover, I'm sure you can download it or rent it, is Frank Capra's Meet John Doe. It was made in 1941. It was written by Robert Riskin, who famously wrote It Could Happen One Night, which, frankly, that movie sort of invented the romantic comedy, the modern romantic comedy as we know it. But Meet John Doe is an entirely different kind of an animal, movie-wise. It stars Gary Cooper and Walter Brennan and Jean Arthur. And there's also one of the most incredible performances in movie history by one of those great and little-known Hollywood character actors, James Gleason. He has a monologue that is, I think, the definition of I think, the highest form of American patriotism. And I recommend that movie. If you had seen it once, it's worth revisiting. And it really speaks to the danger of, just the rise of totalitarianism. Edward Arnold plays this owner of newspapers and media, and he has ambitions to gain the highest offices, and he looks strikingly familiar to a character that we're looking at every day, the PVP. So I recommend. It's a beautiful movie. It's funny, and at the same time, it cuts to some very important social issues that feel more relevant today than ever, and that is Frank Capra's Meet John Doe. Now, Capra, in my view, is one of the American masters, but I consider Meet John Doe the peak, him at his absolute pinnacle, and that's not to diminish movies like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, It Happened One Night, to name a few. I'm sure I'm missing some, but Meet John Doe, to me, represents him at the absolute pinnacle of the powers of social observation, comedy, and also a withering kind of critique on the danger of fascism in America. So that movie I wanted to just recommend to people. If you haven't seen it, go see it, find it, rent it, whatever. And if you've seen it, look at it again. It's worth visiting. And then this movie, I think, has a companion piece, Meet John Doe, and that is another, and this is perhaps my favorite director. This is also a Warner Brothers movie. Capra made most of his movies for Columbia, which is just down the street, or was down the street, on Gower, famously in Gower Gulch. That's where Columbia Studios originated before they moved to Burbank, and I don't really know where they live now, but yes, Capra made most of his movies at Columbia, and then this was an exception, which he made it at Warner Brothers, and that was Meet John Doe. And like I said, the companion piece, make a fantastic double feature, is Elia Kazan's A Face in the Crowd, which stars Andy Griffith. We might remember him from the Andy Griffith Show. This was the movie that made him, and he played Lonesome Rhodes, kind of backwoods country bumpkin with a guitar and a gift for gab, and he gets discovered in the hinterlands, plucked out of a prison, actually, a jail, by a roving radio reporter named played by Patricia Neal. And the movie also stars Lee Remick and Walter Matthau in his sort of pre-comedy days, before he had found his major love interest in life, which was Jack Lemmon, and those two became, great, the odd couple of movies. This was before them, and he plays this frustrated Southern Vanderbilt-era social observer who's watching this phenomena of this rise of lonesome roads from, the obscure backwaters of the South into the pinnacle of American celebrity and popularity. And once again, that danger of totalitarianism, authoritarianism, all the isms that are barking at our door on the American scene, they're all in full display brought to life by Elia Kazan. And this movie was, that was 1957, and it was written by Bud Schulberg. Bud Schulberg also collaborated with Kazan on the Waterfront, another brilliant movie in a different way, but both massively authentic and socially observant, and have stood the test of time quite admirably. So, A Face in the Crowd, and it's the movie that made Andy Griffith. I think he'd been in a play called No Time for Sergeants, but when Kazan found Andy Griffith, he literally chewed the scenery. It's one of the great over-the-top but brilliant and truthful American performances. And one of the great things about that movie, someone who wants to direct movies, who's directed one, is the authenticity of place. You really believe the South. You really believe the world of the television networks, at least in the 50s. And it just feels so authentic and so real and so timely and so cutting in this era of the PVP, Putin's vice president. And we're all struggling under that. And so 2 recommendations, cinema-wise. Frank Capra's Meet John Doe and Kazan's A Face in the Crowd. Not his most famous movie. There's many that we remember more, whether it was Streetcar Named Desire, Splendor in the Grass. But A Face in the Crowd, I think, is emerging. It feels more relevant, more timely, and more meaningful than ever. So I recommend seeing that movie. So there's a couple oldie movie recommendations from myself, The Rebel Without Applause. And what are we coming up on anniversary-wise? We are now coming up on the 150th year anniversary of the 14th Amendment. Now, why is the 14th Amendment important? Well, it was one of 3 amendments that were somehow miraculously passed in the years after the Civil War, and it remains one of the 3 major trophies that the Northern victory in the Civil War basically yielded. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. They were at once massively idealistic. The 13th abolished slavery, and that was in 1865 that was passed. And in July of 1868, so that would be 150 years, I think, ago, we have the 14th Amendment, which basically memorialized this into law and the Constitution, and that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. And no state, meaning California, Oklahoma, can infringe upon that right. That is a federal right guaranteed by the Congress, and any the federal jurisdiction that is guaranteed. And not only did it guarantee citizenship, but these that could not be denied. The freedoms associated with citizenship could not be abridged or denied to any person within its jurisdiction, and it guaranteed to them equal protection of the laws. And that term, equal protection, has been massively important in follow-up Supreme Court decisions over the intervening decades. And then in 1870, so we're still off on that one for the 150th anniversary, is the 15th Amendment, which basically said that ensured voting rights to blacks and Native Americans, and previous conditions of servitude could not abridge that right, and the Congress shall have indeed the power to enforce this article by legislation, which paved the way for the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and all the subsequent acts that people had to wait 100 years for, almost 100 years, before there was any federal action to actually enforce these new amendments to the Constitution. So at the time, they were really false promises, broken promises, but there they were in black and white in the Constitution. It would take, 90 years of Jim Crow and racial codes and all kinds of obstructions and terrorism before there was any real progress made towards memorializing those amendments into not only law but practice on the American scene. And now, what do we see? We see those rights being eroded when attacks on the Voting Rights Act and civil rights and just the rise of the PVP has put all these gains at massive risk. So because of that, I think it's important to recognize this on the 150th anniversary of the 14th Amendment. And that's just another note. And what happened today? Oh, yes, we had the terrible rally, like I mentioned earlier, in Tampa, and the PVP had a tweet storm. He wants that Mueller investigation shuttered, put down, as all his closest confidants now are turning state's evidence, and the Manafort trial is underway. And it reminds me, since we're talking movies, it reminds me, it's like, I don't know, it's like a cross between Dumb and Dumber and Goodfellas. Because as the noose gets tighter, these little rats are squealing like crazy. They're jumping off the ship, and there's less wiggle room for the PVP as, yes, the noose gets tighter. Now, the one thing I'm not confident about, I'm confident that the truth will out in its full clarity. It's actually self-evident now, as I've said on a few occasions. You don't need to connect the dots because the dots are so closely packed together that the picture is self-evident. The corruption is clear as a Seurat pointillistic painting. You don't need to connect any dots. It's pretty clear. So I think we're going to have a sense of the truth if you don't really feel it already. But I don't know if we're going to have the sense of justice, that the perpetrators will be punished to the full extent of the law. They will be humiliated, as he already is. They will be frustrated. They will be driven to a kind of insane distraction. But I'm not certain that we're going to get that kind of satisfying perp walk moment that I think the PVP deserves. It's not unlike with Nixon. We had the satisfaction of his resignation. We had the satisfaction of knowing the truth. We had the satisfaction of seeing the humiliation, but we did not have the satisfaction of a trial and a conviction and subsequent punishment that was prevented, most of us remember, by Gerald Ford. So as my closing thought, as we reflect back on this little episode 6 installment of A Rebel Without Applause, and the social moment that we're in, specifically that giant gobbler of brain space, the PvP, my recommendation is this. Give him your attention. Give him your criticism. If you feel it, give him your contempt. Remember, what we do now will matter later, but don't. Do all those things for sure, but don't, and I repeat, do not give him your happiness. Hold on to that. Protect it. Defend it at all costs, because in the end, that's what he wants. He wants the best part of our soul. He wants to take that and crush it in his hands. Don't give him that. And accordingly, yesterday, I had one of those sort of perfect Los Angeles days. It was hot. Temperature was bubbling in the mid-90s. I couldn't even focus here in my little in the movie studio apartment here. So I did what I always do when my brain space gets clouded and I have a little time on my hands. I strapped my little surfboard, actually a big surfboard, a 10-4 Flowmaster made by Scott Anderson, and I headed out to Malibu, and the waves were raking in just beautifully. We were at the tail end of a big southern swell, and it just seemed like the day and the waves and the water and the crowd just aligned perfectly for me. And I was out there at the top of First Point and was able to snag off 3 or 4 just beautiful waves from outside all the way into the base of the cove there at Surfrider Beach. One of the really it's one of the really sacred spaces for me on earth. It is. People go to church on Sundays. I go to Malibu. That's my church. And then from there, after really just a wonderful surf session, I got into my car and I headed east, back down the PCH. And there's a few pursuits that I want to get into in subsequent podcasts about things I'm looking for in LA, and one is the perfect fried chicken. And I was able to, I think, find what I believe to be the best fried chicken in LA. It's called Golden Bird on Crenshaw Boulevard. So I had a fantastic sampling of this Creole guy's little storefront place in the hood on Crenshaw Boulevard, south of the 10, and had this great chicken. And then I proceeded to another one of my favorite sacred spaces in LA. That's the World Stage for the Thursday night jam session, where I brought my trusted licorice stick, my clarinet, and I played all manner of tunes with the really fantastic resident rhythm section there on Thursday nights. That's Casey McCoy on piano, Bobby Lee on bass, and people rotating through the on the bandstand on drums, bass, guitar, what have you. And what did I play? I played Hot House. That was my call. Hot House, which is Tad Dameron tune. Same chords, by the way, as Cole Porter's What Is This Thing Called Love? So made for just a perfect sort of late afternoon into the evening Los Angeles kind of experience, sort of my tribute to Anthony Gold, who I want to talk about him and Anthony Bourdain next on another podcast, but both of whom recently left us. So that was my answer to the times we're in. I seize back my happiness through things that I love, and that's something you got to do, because you can give him everything, but don't give him that. Anyway, thanks again for joining me here on the Cockeyed Caravan. I'm your rebel without applause, Bill Kalmanson, and have a good one.